It hits you like a bolt. The sheer scale of it. The Green Revolution, this radical shift in agriculture, it's credited with saving over 1 billion people from starvation.
1 billion, yeah.
Think about that, 1 billion lives. It's almost hard to wrap your head around.
It truly is a monumental achievement. And it just underscores the gravity, the transformative power of what we're diving into today.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we're doing, this deep dive into the Green Revolution. You've shared some, well, incredibly rich material. And our goal is really to pull out the essential insights. What does this pivotal period mean for someone listening, someone looking to get a solid understanding without getting sort of bogged down?
Right.
We've got sources covering, well, everything from its origins, the explosion in food security it triggered, to the societal shifts, the environmental consequences, even, what might be next for food.
Precisely. It's a story with many layers, isn't it? And grasping those different facets is really key to understanding its lasting impact.
Okay, so to get us started then, what was the Green Revolution in its simplest form? Like, what are we actually talking about here?
Okay, so at its core, the Green Revolution was this concentrated global effort. It really kicked off after World War II, lasted maybe until the late 1980s, give or take.
Right.
And it was focused on transferring agricultural technologies to, well, dramatically increase crop yields.
So more food from the same land.
Pretty much, yeah. It started in developed nations and then spread across the globe. That was the basic idea.
What were the key innovations that made this possible? What were the sort of game changers?
Well, there were several critical developments that kind of came together. First was the breeding and widespread adoption of high-yielding varieties, HYVs.
HYVs, right.
Especially dwarf wheat and rice. These new seeds were engineered to produce just a much larger amount of grain per plant.
But they needed more.
More
inputs.
Exactly. They were hungrier for nutrients, which leads to the second key element, the extensive use of synthetic chemical fertilizers, lots of it. And then, to protect these more densely grown, nutrient-rich crops, pesticides also became widespread.
Right. Makes sense.
And finally, controlled irrigation systems were absolutely crucial. These new varieties needed that water to thrive.
So seeds, fertilizer, pesticides, water.
That's the package. And often, this whole thing was implemented alongside mechanization, tractors, machinery, boosting efficiency.
It sounds like a very deliberate, very coordinated push.
Yeah.
Who are the main players involved in making all this happen?
You're right, it was. The Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation were really instrumental, particularly in getting things off the ground in Mexico. That was kind of the test bed.
Okay.
And then there were these visionary individuals who became, closely linked to the movement. Norman Borlaug, of course.
The father of the Green Revolution.
Often called that, yeah. He was pivotal in developing those high-yielding wheat varieties, got the Nobel Peace Prize for it.
Why?
And in China, you had Yuan Longping. His work on hybrid rice had a similar massive impact, credited with saving countless lives there.
Incredible.
And we should also remember M.S. Swaminathan. He played a vital role in adapting and implementing these innovations in India.
Okay, so we've got a good overview of what it was. Now let's dig into where it all began. Where did the actual term Green Revolution even come from?
That's interesting, actually. The term didn't appear right at the start. It was coined later, 1968, by William S. Godd. Yeah, he was the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Okay.
And in a speech, he was observing these profound agricultural changes happening and wanted to distinguish it, from other kinds of revolutions. Well, like the Red Revolution in the Soviet Union or the White Revolution in Iran. He wanted to emphasize its focus purely on agricultural advancement.
Hence green.
Exactly. And the name Green Revolution just stuck after that.
That makes sense, highlighting the focus on agriculture. Now, you mentioned Mexico as the starting point. What exactly happened there? What kicked it off?
Yeah, Mexico is often seen as the birthplace, but also maybe a bit of a cautionary tale in some ways.
Oh, how so?
Well, the initial hopes were incredibly high, but later on, some significant challenges emerged. It really started back in 1940, a visit from Henry A. Wallace.
Who later became U.S. Vice President, right?
That's the one. He was deeply involved in agricultural innovation himself, and he was apparently struck by the incredibly low corn yields in Mexico. Most people there were farmers,
Right.
And he saw that a Mexican farmer needed a huge amount of time just to grow a small amount of corn compared to U.S. farmers using hybrid seeds.
A massive productivity gap then.
Mm-hmm.
So what did Wallace do about it?
He persuaded the Rockefeller Foundation to fund an agricultural research station right there in Mexico.
Okay.
The specific goal was to develop hybrid corn and wheat varieties that could thrive in Mexico's drier conditions. And a key figure he brought in was Norman Borlaug.
Ah, Borlaug again?
Yep, a young, driven agronomist at the time. And this initiative had strong support not just from Rockefeller, but the Mexican government, the U.S. government, the UN, the FAO.
So a big international effort focused on Mexico.
Definitely. For the U.S., Mexico was seen as this crucial proving ground, use technology to boost agriculture, create a model they could maybe replicate globally.
And what were Mexico's goals?
Well, food self-sufficiency was huge, feeding its growing population, and also easing the pressure on land redistribution efforts, which was a big political issue.
And it sounds like Mexico saw almost immediate success. Was it that fast?
It was remarkably fast, yeah. Within just 8 years of Wallace's visit, so by 1948, Mexico didn't need to import food anymore.
Wow.
First time since, 1910. Within 2 decades, their corn production tripled and wheat production went up 5-fold.
A fivefold.
Yeah. By the mid-50s, Mexico wasn't just self-sufficient in wheat, they were actually exporting it.
Incredible.
And of course, Borlaug's foundational work there eventually led to his Nobel Prize. The Mexican government also played a crucial role, investing in agriculture, training their own scientists.
So it really showed the potential.
It absolutely demonstrated the rapid potential of targeted agricultural technology to achieve food self-sufficiency, set a powerful precedent. But, as I said, one that later revealed its own set of challenges, too.
Right. We'll probably come back to those. Now, you also mentioned IR-8 rice in the Philippines. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, the Philippines is another key early success story, especially in Asia. Back in 1960, the Philippine government teamed up with the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations again.
Right.
They established the International Rice Research Institute, or IRI.
IRI, I've heard of that.
Right, became a major hub for rice research. So in 1962, researchers there did this crossbreeding experiment between 2 different rice varieties.
And that led to IR-8.
Led to IR-8, yeah, which was released in 1966. President Ferdinand Marcos then made IR-8 the cornerstone of this big program called Masagana 99.
Masagana 99. What did that involve?
It basically included providing credit to farmers so they could afford to adopt the new seeds and the necessary fertilizers.
So IR-8 was a real game changer for rice production there. Did it work as well as the wheat in Mexico?
In terms of yield? Oh, yeah, it certainly was. IR-8, it did require more fertilizers and pesticides than the traditional varieties, no question.
Right.
But it produced significantly higher yields. Within about 20 years, the annual rice production in the Philippines more than doubled.
Doubled. Wow.
And the country became a net exporter of rice for the first time in the 20th century. Though it's important to note, over the long haul, imports still slightly edged out exports, but still a huge shift.
Still a very significant shift.
Yeah.
But you hinted earlier there were some problems with the Masagana 99 program.
Yes, unfortunately. By the 1980s, that credit scheme ran into difficulties. It seems the loans increasingly went to wealthier landowners.
Ah, so not reaching the small farmers as much.
Exactly, leaving smaller, poorer farmers burdened with debt they couldn't repay. The program also faced criticism for becoming, shall we say, intertwined with political patronage.
Okay, so a familiar story sometimes.
Yeah. So while that initial boost in production was undeniable, the socioeconomic outcomes were, well, more complex, not universally positive.
That's a really important point, isn't it? Were there any early signs that Masagana 99 might have these kinds of unintended social consequences?
That's a good question. It really highlights that technology isn't always neutral, is it? How it's implemented, the policies around it, they matter just as much as the tech itself.
Right, a crucial reminder. Technological solutions aren't always a silver bullet. They can have these unforeseen societal impacts. Okay, what about India? How did the Green Revolution take root there?
India's experience is another massive part of the story. It really began in 1961. M.S. Swaminathan, who we mentioned earlier, he was an advisor to the Indian Minister of Agriculture.
Right.
He invited Norman Borlaug to India.
Go.
Now, there were some initial bureaucratic hurdles, apparently, but eventually the Ford Foundation and the Indian government collaborated. They imported high-yielding wheat seeds from CMYT. That's the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, based in Mexico, where Borlaug did his key work.
Got it.
So they brought these seeds to India, and the state of Punjab was selected as the initial focus.
Why Punjab specifically?
Mainly because it had a reliable water supply, fertile land, and already a pretty solid agricultural base to build on. So India then launched its own Green Revolution program, focusing on plant breeding, expanding irrigation infrastructure, and providing financing for the agrochemicals, the fertilizers, and pesticides.
And how did India's adoption of these new technologies go? Was it as dramatic as Mexico or the Philippines?
It was remarkably impactful, yes. India also adopted IR-8 rice, the miracle rice.
Same one for
Yeah,
the Philippines.
it's the very same. In 1968, an Indian agricultural scientist, S.K. Datta, published research showing just how productive IR-8 could be, significantly higher yields than traditional rice, even without fertilizer, apparently.
Really? Even without?
Yeah, but with optimal conditions, fertilizer, water, it was dramatically more productive. It got hailed as miracle rice all across Asia.
I can imagine.
And over time, rice yields in India tripled. The country went from being heavily reliant on food imports to becoming a major rice exporter.
So a real turning point for India's food security then.
Wow. Now, China's path seems to have been quite different from what I understand. Less direct involvement from the foundations.
Yes, China's Green Revolution had its own very distinct character. You have to remember, for the Chinese Communist Party coming to power in 1949,
Right.
boosting food production, especially rice, was just a paramount priority. Huge growing population.
Makes sense.
So their approach, initially at least, focused more on strengthening traditional crop production methods. They promoted biological pest control, integrated modern science with existing peasant knowledge.
Interesting approach.
Yeah, building up national food reserves, using high-yield seeds where available, encouraging multi-cropping, planting multiple crops per year on the same land, and expanding controlled irrigation. A lot of this started with significant land reform in 1950, redistributing land to peasants.
So less of a direct adoption of that Western foundation-led model initially. Exactly. China's Green Revolution wasn't as directly tied to those American initiatives as, say, Mexico, the Philippines, or India. It was more driven by government-sponsored agricultural research, working closely with farmers' practical experience.
But they still benefited from international research.
Oh, yes. They definitely drew on earlier international research. And Yuan Longping's pioneering work on hybrid rice was absolutely pivotal.
We mentioned him earlier.
Yeah, he's considered a national hero in China. Massive contributions to boosting rice yields, helping China achieve food security. Today, China is a leading global rice exporter.
Another huge success story then, but achieved differently.
Yes, though they've also faced challenges like depletion of groundwater from all the irrigation and increased greenhouse gas emissions from fertilizer use. But it's notable they achieved food security without significantly increasing the amount of land under cultivation. It was all about yield per hectare.
Fascinating how different countries adapted the core principles. What about Brazil? Their agricultural revolution in the Cerrado region sounds particularly unique, transforming infertile land.
Brazil's story in the Cerrado is, yeah, a truly remarkable transformation. Before the 1960s, this huge inland area was largely considered, well, unfarmable.
Why was that?
The soil was extremely acidic and lacked essential nutrients, just really poor soil for conventional farming.
Okay.
But starting in the 1960s, there was this massive, sustained effort to apply lime.
Lime, like the mineral.
Essentially, yeah.
Lime.
Pulverized chalk or limestone. They spread it on the soil to neutralize the acidity. And this went on for decades. Millions of tons of lime spread annually.
Wow, that's a huge undertaking. And it worked.
It worked spectacularly well. Brazil transformed the Cerrado. Today, it's the world's second largest exporter of soybeans.
Second largest from unfarmable land.
Exactly. And because soybeans are such a major component of animal feed, this also massively contributed to Brazil becoming a leading global exporter of beef and poultry.
That really highlights how fundamental soil science and, well, large-scale intervention can completely reshape agricultural potential.
Amazing. Now, the picture in Africa seems to be much more complex. Why didn't the Green Revolution have the same kind of widespread success there?
You're right, the success rates in Africa have been considerably lower and much more varied. It's not a simple story. There are several interconnected factors.
Such as?
Well, issues like widespread corruption, political instability, insecurity. These are huge barriers. Plus, a lack of adequate infrastructure roads for transport, storage facilities, market access for farmers. All that played a significant role.
And environmental factors.
Absolutely crucial, too. The availability of reliable water for irrigation just isn't as consistent across much of the continent compared to, say, the big river valleys in Asia.
Right.
And there's just a huge diversity in terrain and soil types, even within relatively small areas. So a uniform one-size-fits-all approach, like applying HYVs and fertilizer everywhere, it's just very difficult to make that work across the board. Were there any attempts to implement Green Revolution strategies at all in Africa?
Oh, yes, definitely. There have been numerous initiatives. One example is NERICA.
NERICA.
Stands for New Rice for Africa. These are high-yielding rice varieties specifically developed for African conditions. They have the potential, apparently, to produce more rice with less fertilizer and just basic irrigation.
Sounds promising.
It does, but getting these seeds into the hands of farmers has proven to be a major challenge. The only really significant success story so far has been in Guinea, apparently.
Limited success then. Any other examples?
Well, there's the interesting case of Malawi's agricultural input subsidy program. The government subsidized fertilizer and seeds for smallholder farmers, and initially they saw impressive gains in corn harvests.
Okay, so it worked there.
Initially, yes, but the success wasn't sustained over the long term. Production eventually dropped again. More recently, though, a 2021 study in Mozambique did show positive impacts from using Green Revolution tech, but when combined with effective subsidy programs.
So the support system is key.
It suggests the potential is there. But the implementation, the policy context, it all needs to be carefully managed. It's not just about the seeds and fertilizer in isolation.
So it's not a simple narrative of failure in Africa, but maybe a more nuanced story of potential that faces really significant obstacles. You also mentioned the CGIAR earlier. What role did they play in all of this?
Right. The CGIAR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. It was established in 1971, actually right around the time Borlaug got his Nobel Prize.
Okay.
It was created to support a global network of agricultural research centers, specifically focused on developing countries. The World Bank was key, along with the FAO.
The Food and Agriculture Organization.
Yep. And IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and the UNDP, the UN Development Program, they were all involved in its formation.
So coordinating research globally.
Pretty much. Over time, CGIAR has expanded to include numerous research centers all around the world. And importantly, CGIAR has also evolved.
How so?
Well, partly in response to some of the criticisms leveled against those initial Green Revolution approaches. They started incorporating more holistic perspectives, things like agroecosystem analysis, farming systems research, basically aiming for more sustainable and environmentally sensitive solutions.
That sounds like a critical evolution, acknowledging the broader impacts and striving for more sustainable methods. Okay, now let's maybe delve into the technological developments themselves. You mentioned advancements in cultivation and breeding. Can you elaborate a bit on those?
Certainly. So the Green Revolution largely involved taking agricultural technologies that already existed, mostly used in industrialized nations, and disseminating them much more widely.
Right.
In terms of cultivation, the key technologies were, 1, developing and expanding modern irrigation projects for reliable water. 2, the increased use of synthetic pesticides for pest and disease control. And 3, the widespread application of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer to feed these hungry, high-yielding crops.
Right, the inputs we discussed. And on the breeding side, what were the major scientific breakthroughs there that were truly new?
Okay, yeah. The really innovative aspect was the breeding of these high-yielding varieties, the HYVs, staple crops like wheat, rice, corn.
And what made them high-yielding?
Fundamentally, they had an enhanced ability to absorb nitrogen fertilizer. They could just use more of it effectively. But there was a side effect.
Which was?
They were susceptible to lodging.
Lodging, meaning they fell over.
Exactly. Their stems would weaken under the weight of the much heavier grain heads, and they'd fall over before harvest. Big problem.
So how did they fix that?
Plant breeders incorporated semi-dwarfing genes into their genomes, made the plants shorter and sturdier.
Dwarf varieties.
Precisely. A Japanese dwarf wheat variety called Norin 10 was particularly significant in developing these shorter, stronger-stemmed wheat cultivars. And Norman Borlaug, back at CMYT in Mexico, played a crucial role here too. He bred rust-resistant varieties that also had these sturdy stems. They could handle high levels of fertilization and bad weather without collapsing.
It's amazing how these seemingly small genetic changes making the plant shorter could have such a profound impact on agricultural output.
Yeah.
Do we understand the underlying genetics of this dwarfism now?
Yes, we do. Much better now. Plant scientists figured out the genes that control things like plant height and the number of tillers or shoots a plant produces.
Right.
With advances in molecular genetics, they've identified the specific mutant genes responsible for dwarfism in various key plants. Often, these involve genes in the pathway for making gibberellins.
Gibberellins. Plant hormones.
Exactly, plant hormones that regulate stem growth. In these dwarf varieties, the plant basically invests less energy in making a long stem.
And puts more into the grain.
Precisely. It redirects more resources towards producing grain, so it amplifies the effect of the chemical fertilizers on the actual commercial yield, the part you eat or sell.
Fascinating.
Yeah, specific genes like GA20 oxidase G1, G13 in Arabidopsis, that's a model plant they study a lot, and then R8 wheat and SD1 in rice. These are some of the key genes involved. They figured out which genes, especially those affecting hormones like gibberellins, controlled stem growth. By selecting for versions that made shorter stems, the plants could support much heavier grain yields.
That's truly fascinating, getting down to the molecular level of this agricultural revolution. Okay, so we've discussed the technologies, but what kind of actual increases in food production did they lead to? What are the numbers?
The production increases were, well, substantial. One estimate from a 2021 study, I think, suggests the Green Revolution led to about a 44% increase in yields between 1965 and 2010.
44% globally.
Roughly, yeah, across the board for the relevant crops. Cereal production in developing nations more than doubled between 1961 and 1985.
Doubled in just over 2 decades.
Yeah. And we saw pretty consistent increases in the yields of rice, corn, and wheat during that whole period. For Asian rice specifically, research indicates that irrigation expansion, fertilizer application, and the new seeds, they each contributed roughly equally to those big increases.
So it wasn't just one thing, it was the whole package working together.
Exactly.
But it wasn't all positive gains, was it?
Yeah.
I seem to recall reading about the increased energy requirements. That seems like a big factor.
That's a critical consideration, absolutely. While agricultural output saw massive increases, the energy needed to produce those crops grew even faster.
Faster than the output.
Yeah. Green Revolution techniques are heavily reliant on agricultural machinery and all those chemical inputs we've discussed, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, defoliants. And as of, well, even fairly recently, these are largely derived from crude oil, fossil fuels.
So it tied agriculture much more closely to oil.
Definitely. It made modern agriculture increasingly dependent on fossil fuels. So the Green Revolution, while solving this critical problem of food scarcity, also really deepened agriculture's connection to and dependence on the fossil fuel industry.
Okay, so that's a major trade-off to keep in mind. Let's move on to the really big question then. Food security. How did the Green Revolution impact that on a global scale? This is the billion lives saved part, right?
Right. The impact on food security is arguably the most profound outcome, yes. The development and widespread use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer in particular. It's been so transformative that it's estimated that almost nearly half of the current global population is fed directly because of its use.
Half the world fed because of synthetic fertilizer.
That's the estimate. As one expert from the fertilizer industry apparently put it, people don't realize that 50% of the world's food relies on fertilizers. It's staggering.
That is absolutely staggering. And we've obviously seen massive growth in global population since the Green Revolution began. It allowed that growth.
It certainly supported it. The world's population has increased by roughly 5 billion people since the start of the Green Revolution. Yeah. In India, for instance, annual wheat production just soared from about 10 million tons in the 1960s to over 70 million tons by 2006.
Huge jump.
And on average, people in the developing world now consume about 25% more calories per day than they did before the Green Revolution kicked in. Between 1950 and 1984, world grain production saw this remarkable 160% increase.
Incredible growth.
These substantial increases are widely, and I think rightly, credited with playing a crucial role in averting widespread famine and providing sustenance for billions of people.
So it's hard to argue against the success in terms of sheer food quantity and preventing mass starvation. But there have been criticisms, haven't there? Particularly related to Malthusian ideas about population growth outstripping food supply.
Yes, there definitely have been. Some criticisms draw on the theories of Thomas Malthus, who predicted population growth would inevitably outstrip the food supply, leading to famine and misery.
Right, the Malthusian trap.
Exactly. Concerns were raised that the Green Revolution, while boosting food production temporarily, was ultimately unsustainable, that humanity was still on track to exceed the Earth's carrying capacity.
But did that happen?
Well, interestingly, a 2021 study actually found something different. Contrary to those Malthusian expectations, it found the Green Revolution was associated with reduced population growth, not an increase.
Reduced. That seems counterintuitive. How could more food lead to lower population growth?
The study suggests that the increased food security and the associated improvements in living standards that often came with the Green Revolution can actually contribute to lower fertility rates over time.
Ah, the demographic transition idea.
Sort of, yeah. It goes against the simple idea that more food automatically means more people, without any other factors changing. It's more complex.
Right.
And it's worth remembering, Malthus's own bleak predictions of widespread famine didn't really come to pass, did they? Even as the world's population doubled multiple times after he wrote. And similarly, those dire predictions of mass starvation in the late 20th century, people like Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb.
Yeah, I remember that book.
They also proved incorrect, at least in the time frame predicted, partly because of the advancements of the Green Revolution.
And even Norman Borlaug himself, the father of it all, he recognized the ongoing challenge of population growth, didn't he? He didn't think it was a permanent fix.
Absolutely not. In his Nobel lecture, he explicitly said the Green Revolution had bought humanity some crucial breathing space in the fight against hunger. But he strongly emphasized that the, quote, frightening power of human reproduction needed to be addressed. Otherwise, the gains would just be temporary. He hoped humanity would eventually recognize and act on the dangers of unchecked population growth.
So even the architects saw it as a temporary measure needing complementary action on population. It seems the relationship between food and population is much more complex than simple cause and effect. What about the different perspectives on the causes of famine itself? I recall reading about some contrasting views there, particularly involving Amartya Sen.
Yes, that's a really significant debate in this area. The economist Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate himself, famously argued that major historical famines weren't primarily caused by an absolute lack of food supply overall,
But
by socioeconomic factors and failures in public action. Essentially, people not having access to the food that was actually available. Entitlement failures, he called it.
Okay.
But another economist, Peter Bobrick, has strongly challenged Sen's theory. He argues it lacks consistency and actually contradicts available evidence from specific famines.
So a direct counterargument.
Yeah. Bobrick even suggests that Sen's views inadvertently aligned with the approach of the Bengal government during the devastating 1943 famine, an approach that ultimately failed to provide adequate relief.
Wow. Okay. So it's a reminder that even when sufficient food exists on paper, distribution, access, political will, those are absolutely critical factors in preventing actual starvation.
Exactly. It's not just about total production numbers.
Right. So shifting from the sheer quantity of food to its quality.
Yeah.
What impact did the Green Revolution have on people's actual diets? More calories doesn't always better nutrition, is it?
That's another very important aspect to consider, and a major area of criticism, frankly. While the Green Revolution succeeded in boosting the overall yields of cereal grains, wheat, rice, corn, and preventing mass starvation,
Yes.
it didn't always prioritize nutritional quality. The focus was often on monoculture crops, growing vast fields of just one thing.
Right.
And often these were grown for export or animal feed, or even biofuel, not just direct human consumption. This led to a decrease in dietary diversity in some regions, fewer types of food being grown and eaten.
And that lack of diversity had consequences.
Yes, there are definite concerns that these dietary shifts resulted in increased rates of malnutrition. Not necessarily lack of calories, but lack of essential micronutrients. Things like iron deficiency, vitamin A deficiency became bigger problems in some areas. Plus, some of the high-yield cereal crops themselves, the HYVs, have been found to have lower protein quality compared to traditional varieties, deficiencies in certain essential amino acids.
So less balanced protein.
Potentially, yes. They can also be very high in carbohydrates and might lack a balanced profile of essential fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, compared to a more diverse traditional diet.
That sounds like a pretty significant trade-off. More calories, maybe, but potentially fewer essential nutrients. Were there any other negative impacts on diet people noticed?
Yes, a couple other things. For example, some of the high-yield rice varieties introduced in parts of Asia were reportedly, well, less tasty.
Less tasty.
Inferior flavor and texture compared to the native varieties people were used to, which sometimes meant they actually got lower prices in local markets. And also, particularly in the Philippines, the heavy use of pesticides in rice paddies, especially early on,
Yes.
it inadvertently poisoned and killed off fish and nutritious leafy green vegetables that traditionally grew in the rice paddies alongside the rice.
Oh, wow. So it destroyed other food sources.
Exactly. And those were often important food sources, especially for poorer farming communities who relied on foraging in the paddies.
So the Green Revolution, while aiming to solve one critical problem, starvation may have inadvertently created or worsened others related to nutrition and dietary diversity. Okay, let's turn our attention now to the broader socioeconomic impacts. We touched on some issues in the Philippines with the credit scheme, but what were the overall effects on societies? Did it lift people out of poverty generally?
Well, a 2021 study indicated that overall, the Green Revolution did lead to a substantial increase in income levels globally.
Really? How much?
The study even estimated that if the Green Revolution technologies had been delayed by just 10 years, it would have resulted in a significant loss of GDP per capita worldwide. And if it had never occurred at all, the GDP per capita in the developing world could have been roughly halved.
Halved. Wow, that's a powerful statistic, highlighting significant broad economic benefits then. Okay, now let's tackle the environmental impacts. This is often cited as a major area of concern and debate, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. The environmental consequences are a critical part of the Green Revolution's legacy. And yeah, they've been the subject of considerable, often heated discussion.
So, starting with biodiversity, what was the impact there? Did it save forests by intensifying farming on existing land?
Well, that was an initial hypothesis, yes. The idea was, by increasing productivity on existing farmland, the Green Revolution would reduce the need to clear new land forests, wetlands, etc., for agriculture.
Makes theoretical sense.
Theoretically, yes. Could potentially help protect wild biodiversity, however. The reality has been more complex.
How's
Well, in some areas, the very intensive farming practices themselves led to land degradation, depletion of soil nutrients, erosion,
right?
which in turn actually forced farmers to clear more forests than other natural habitats just to maintain their production levels over time.
So intensification in one place might have indirectly driven expansion elsewhere.
Precisely. Plus, the traditional agricultural systems that were often displaced by the Green Revolution.
The ones with more diverse crops.
Yeah, they often incorporated practices that actually helped preserve local biodiversity. Think diverse crop rotations, intercropping, saving local seeds. That got lost with monocultures.
Okay.
And then there's the fact that breeders developed new crop varieties tolerant to marginal lands, like those wheat varieties that could grow in acidic soils in Brazil.
Right, the Cerrado example.
Exactly. That opened up previously unprofitable or unsuitable areas for agriculture, potentially leading to further habitat loss in areas that were previously untouched.
So a more complicated picture on land use and biodiversity.
Definitely. The Rio Treaty back in 1992 explicitly acknowledged agriculture's significant contribution to biodiversity loss. And even early critics, people like Carlo Sauer way back, warned about the risks of agricultural standardization, losing native resources and local cultures.
Okay. What about greenhouse gas emissions? That's another huge environmental concern linked to modern agriculture.
A major one, yes. Studies have indeed shown that the Green Revolution significantly increased CO2 emissions.
How? Through fertilizer production, machinery.
Both and more. Those high-yield agricultural practices have substantial effects on carbon cycling. The way the crops are cultivated, their seasonal carbon uptake and release, it all alters the impact of atmospheric carbon on global warming.
Right.
Major crops like wheat, rice, and soybeans have contributed significantly to the increase in atmospheric carbon over the past few decades, but maybe even more significant is nitrous oxide.
Nitrous oxide. From fertilizer.
Exactly. The often poorly regulated use of nitrogen fertilizer, particularly when it's applied broadly as urea, leads to the emission of nitrous oxide, N2O.
And that's worse than CO2.
Oh, much worse. It's an extremely potent greenhouse gas, hundreds of times more potent than CO2 over the long term. And excess nitrogen also contributes massively to water pollution, eutrophication, dead zones.
A double whammy.
Yeah. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food put it pretty bluntly in 2022, said our current food systems contribute about a third of all global greenhouse gas emissions.
A third? Wow.
And drive the alarming decline in biodiversity, largely as a result of the intensive industrial agriculture practices adopted since the Green Revolution.
And the IPCC agrees.
The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has echoed these findings, noting that intensive agriculture has led to soil degradation, loss of natural resources, significantly contributed to climate change. They also highlight excessive agrochemical use, inefficient water use, loss of beneficial biodiversity, pollution. It's a long list.
It really sounds like the environmental costs have been substantial and are now rightly, a major focus of global concern. However, there was one potential positive environmental impact. You mentioned earlier something about land use overall. Did it reduce the total amount of land farmed?
Yes, that 2021 study did suggest that. The argument is that by achieving higher yields on existing farmland, the Green Revolution may have reduced the pressure to convert additional natural habitats into agricultural land, at least compared to what might have happened otherwise if yields hadn't increased.
So potentially a smaller overall footprint in terms of land conversion, even if land used is farmed much more intensively.
That's the idea, yes. It's a complex calculation, balancing intensification against expansion, but there's some evidence pointing that way.
Okay, that's an interesting counterpoint.
Yeah.
Now, let's consider the health impacts beyond just nutrition, which we discussed. Were there any other major health consequences, positive or negative, associated with the Green Revolution?
Well, on the positive side, studies have shown a really significant beneficial impact on infant mortality in the developing world.
Infant mortality went down.
Substantially, yes. Research from 2020 looking at dozens of countries, and also specifically at India, found that the spread of these modern high-yield crop varieties led to significant reductions in infant mortality rates.
Not much.
The effects were apparently particularly strong for male infants in poorer households and in rural areas, so more food availability, better baseline nutrition for mothers and babies. It seems to have saved a lot of young lives. That's a very significant and undeniably positive outcome.
That is a very significant positive outcome. Hard to argue with saving babies' lives. But what about the flip side? The agrochemicals, the pesticides and fertilizers that became so central to Green Revolution agriculture, did they have any adverse health effects on people?
Unfortunately, yes. That's the other side of the coin. The increased production and, crucially, use of pesticides and fertilizers has been linked to potential adverse health impacts.
Like what?
Well, for example, some pesticides have been associated with an increased risk of certain types of cancer and poor farming practices.
Like not using protective gear.
Exactly. Not using adequate protective gear, overuse or misuse of these chemicals that can significantly exacerbate the risks, especially for farm workers.
Are there estimates of the scale of this problem?
Back in the late 1980s, the World Health Organization, WHO, and the UN Environment Program, UNEP, estimated a really large number of annual human pesticide poisonings globally, millions, potentially, with a significant number of fatalities, particularly in developing countries.
Why developing countries specifically?
Often due to factors like inadequate labeling, lack of training, lack of protective equipment, weaker regulations, things like that. More recently, a 2014 study in India also found that children who were exposed to higher quantities of fertilizer agrochemicals experienced a greater number of adverse health issues.
So it's a complex picture then. Saving lives through increased food production, preventing famine, reducing infant mortality, but potentially causing other kinds of harm through the very methods used to achieve those increases.
Exactly. It's a real double-edged sword in many ways.
This really leads us naturally to the idea of a second green revolution.
Yeah.
That term gets thrown around a bit. What is that all about? Is it about fixing the problems of the first one?
In large part, yes. Given the, observed declining rates of yield increase in some areas, the low-hanging fruit has been picked, maybe.
Right.
And the growing awareness, obviously, of the social and environmental costs we've just been discussing. There's a growing recognition that we need to explore and implement new and, crucially, more sustainable approaches to agriculture.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, the second green revolution is kind of an umbrella term. It generally refers to ongoing efforts to develop more environmentally friendly and equitable agricultural practices. This includes a whole range of innovative approaches, things like the system of rice intensification or SRI. Yeah, different ways of managing rice paddies, water, seedlings, often uses less water, fewer inputs. Also using marker-assisted selection and breeding.
Using genetics more precisely.
Exactly. Breeding for more resilient crops, more resource-efficient crops needing less water or fertilizer. Then there's the whole field of agroecology.
Agroecology.
Which emphasizes ecologically sound and sustainable farming methods, working with natural systems, not against them, improving soil health, biodiversity on the farm.
Okay.
And sometimes it's also just about more effective and context-appropriate application of existing technologies in developing countries, learning from past mistakes.
And the driver is, we still need more food, right?
Absolutely. The challenge we face is still significant. Projections indicate we need something like a 70% increase in global food production by 2050 to adequately feed a growing global population. So business as usual isn't really an option.
70% more food. Wow. Okay. And within this concept of a second green revolution, there's the specific idea of the evergreen revolution, which was championed by M.S. Swaminathan himself, right? The Indian scientist we mentioned. What's the core philosophy there?
Right, the evergreen revolution. Swaminathan coined that term around 1990, although he said the basic concept went back even further for him, maybe to 1968.
So right around the time the first green revolution was really taking off.
Exactly. Essentially, it aims to integrate an ecological dimension directly into the agricultural productivity model. His phrase was achieving productivity in perpetuity without associated ecological harm.
Productivity in perpetuity. That's a powerful idea.
It is. It emphasizes the need to integrate scientific advancements not just with yield goals, but with economic and social considerations, and crucially, ecological sustainability to ensure long-term success.
So a more holistic approach from the start.
That's the idea. The renowned biologist E.O. Wilson also emphasized the urgent need for an evergreen revolution. He stressed increasing food production while simultaneously safeguarding biodiversity, recognizing that potential, really detrimental trade-off between unsustainable farming and the natural world.
So is this evergreen revolution concept widely adopted now?
Well, the specific term evergreen revolution might not be as widely known as the original green revolution, but its core principles, sustainability, integrating ecology, social equity, they largely reflect the growing consensus we see in major scientific reports now, like from the IPCC. There's a broad acknowledgement of the limitations and negative consequences of the original project, and the urgent need to pursue a more sustainable, environmentally responsible path for food production globally.
It really sounds like a clear recognition, finally, that we need to learn from both the successes and the shortcomings of the past and work towards a genuinely more sustainable future for how we produce food. Okay, so as we bring this deep dive to a close, what would you say are the most crucial key takeaways for someone listening to all this?
I think, for me, the most important takeaways are really twofold. First, the sheer scale of the Green Revolution's initial impact. It undeniably played a monumental role in saving countless lives, dramatically increasing global food production, effectively preventing the kind of widespread famines that were feared. You can't ignore that.
Right, the positive side is huge.
Huge. However, it's equally critical to understand that this remarkable achievement came with really significant environmental costs: biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, and also certain socioeconomic consequences like impacts on small farmers and public health issues related to agrochemicals that we're still grappling with today. It's a complex balance sheet.
Definitely some real aha moments for me during this discussion.
Yeah.
I think perhaps the surprising speed of adoption in some regions early on.
Yeah.
Also, the fascinating genetic basis of those high-yielding crops, the dwarfism genes.
Yeah, the science is cool.
And just the really complex and ongoing debate surrounding that balance between simply producing more food versus ensuring nutritional quality, dietary diversity, and environmental sustainability. It's not simple.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Those are all absolutely crucial points, and they just underscore the fact that these are really complex issues. There are no easy or straightforward solutions here.
So building on that complexity, here's a final thought-provoking question for you, our listener, to consider. Reflecting on both the extraordinary achievements and the significant shortcomings of the Green Revolution that we've discussed, what do you believe are the most critical factors we absolutely must prioritize now as we strive to achieve truly sustainable food security for a still growing global population, especially in the face of a rapidly changing climate? What roles do technological innovation like genetics, agroecology, government policy, international cooperation, and even our individual choices as consumers? What roles do they all play in shaping this next agricultural evolution?
Yeah, what's the right mix?
Exactly. It's clear the story of how we feed ourselves is far from over.
Yeah.
And it seems to demand ongoing innovation, yes, but also really critical evaluation and much deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of our food systems with everything else, health, environment, society. We hear the phrase good news all the time, right? In headlines, just casual chat.
Yeah, it's pretty common.
But imagine a time when it wasn't just, a throwaway line, when it was this huge life-changing message that actually shaped, well, a whole set of books.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today.
Right. We're tracing that idea, the original good news, and how it became the gospels we know.
Using the material you sent over, we're asking, what are these Gospels? When were they written? Who actually wrote them? And maybe who didn't? And crucially, how do they all fit together?
And look, we know you, our listener, want to get the essentials quickly and, well, properly. That's the goal here.
We've sifted through the sources to pull out the really key stuff without bogging you down in, like, endless academic jargon.
Our mission, then, is to get a solid grasp on what the Gospels are and where they came from, knowing full well that scholars have debated this stuff for, well, ages.
It's a big topic for us.
Let's jump in. First things first. What is a gospel, really?
Well, originally, gospel just meant the Christian message itself, that core good news. It comes from the Greek, evangelium.
Right.
But what's interesting is how that meaning shifted. By the 2nd century AD, people started using gospel to mean the books telling that story.
Ah, okay. So the message became the books about the message.
Pretty much.
Wow.
So when we talk about the Gospels now, we usually mean these books, kind of loose narratives, stories about what Jesus said and did.
Episodic, you mean?
Yeah, episodic, all leading up to his trial, his death, and then, really importantly, the stories of him appearing afterwards, his resurrection appearances.
So not like a modern chronological biography A to Z,
Yeah.
more like snapshots. Our sources mention a specific genre, right? Ancient biography.
Exactly. Scholars classify them as a bios, ancient biography. But you have to understand, ancient biographies weren't like ours today.
How so?
They weren't always aiming for a totally complete minute-by-minute account. It was more about showing the person's character, their teachings.
To make a point.
Yes, often to persuade the reader about their importance, maybe give examples to follow. For the Gospels, the goal was clearly to convince people Jesus was, well, extraordinary.
A charismatic holy man, miracle worker, that kind of thing.
Right, and to spread the Christian message as it was understood later in the 1st century. Because of that purpose, scholars today are a bit cautious about using them as just straight objective history.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because separating the actual historical Jesus from how his followers remembered and interpreted him, that sounds tricky.
It's incredibly challenging. I mean, critical study shows it's really hard to definitively pin down what were Jesus's exact original words versus later theological ideas that grew up in the early church.
So where does that leave scholars now?
Well, a lot of the focus has shifted to understanding Jesus as remembered by those early followers, and, just as importantly, analyzing the Gospels themselves as literature, as theology, reflecting those developing understandings.
Okay, so that brings us to the famous four in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. When were these actually written down?
The general consensus puts them somewhere between, say, AD 66 and AD 110.
66 to 110 AD. That's interesting timing.
It is, because it means they could have been written while people who actually saw the events, eyewitnesses, were still around. Maybe even Jesus' own family.
Wow. So did those eyewitnesses write them? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? Were they the actual authors?
Well, that's where the common understanding and the scholarly view diverge a bit. The majority view among scholars is that the Gospels, as we have them, were originally anonymous.
Anonymous, so the names came later.
Likely added sometime in the 2nd century, yeah. And here's the kicker. It's almost certain that none of them were written directly by an eyewitness, not in the way I'd think of it.
Really?
They're seen more as the end product of a long process. Oral storytelling, written notes, traditions being passed down.
So stories being told and retold, maybe written down in pieces, before becoming the final books.
Exactly. The process definitely involved claims of using eyewitness sources, but the final Gospels are probably a step or two removed from those direct first-hand accounts.
Like that game of telephone. Stories changing as they get passed along.
Some scholars use that analogy, to show how interpretations can shift. But it's also fair to say others argue that oral cultures could preserve stories very accurately.
So different views on how much they changed.
Right. There's debate about how stable those traditions were before they hit the page in their final form.
Okay, and how do these four Gospels relate? I feel like I've heard Mark is usually thought to be the first one.
Yes, that's the most common theory. It's often called the two-source hypothesis, or sometimes the four-source hypothesis. The basic idea is Mark probably came first.
Okay.
Mark first. Then Matthew and Luke, working separately, both used Mark as a kind of narrative backbone for Jesus' ministry.
Right, so they both had Mark's Gospel in front of them, maybe?
That's the idea. But they also seem to have used another source, a collection of Jesus' sayings that scholars have nicknamed Q.
Q. Okay, so Mark plus Q.
Mark plus Q. And then on top of that, both Matthew and Luke also included material that's unique to their gospel, stuff not in Mark or Q.
Ah, so that's where the M and L sources come in. Matthew's own stuff and Luke's own stuff.
Precisely. M for Matthew's unique bits, L for Luke's.
So it's like Mark and Q were shared building blocks for Matthew and Luke.
That's a good way to think about it, but remember, this is the dominant theory, not the only one.
Right.
Some argue for different patterns of borrowing. Maybe Luke used Matthew or vice versa. Others put more weight on shared, reliable oral traditions that go way back.
And some are more skeptical, thinking things changed a lot in the telling.
Exactly. The key thing, though, is that Matthew and Luke aren't totally independent witnesses. They're actively using, editing, and adding to earlier material, especially Mark and probably Q. That really shapes how we read them.
Got it. And John. John always feels like the odd one out.
It really does. There's almost total agreement that John comes from a different setting, a distinct community, the Johannine community.
Johannine community, okay.
And the thinking is it grew out of an earlier collection of miracle stories, sometimes called a signs gospel, which was then expanded with Jesus's long speeches and the Passion story.
Did the author of John know the others, Matthew, Mark, Luke?
Probably. The authors or editors might well have known the synoptics, but they didn't seem to use them as sources in the same way Matthew and Luke used Mark. It's its own stream of tradition.
So to recap the main theory, Mark first, then Matthew and Luke use Mark and Q, plus their own M and L material. John is separate.
That's the standard picture, yes. Like 3 authors using some common blueprints, while John builds next door with different plans.
So when scholars today want to figure out what the historical Jesus might have actually said or done, which Gospels do they lean on most?
Generally, for reconstructing Jesus' public ministry, the focus tends to be on the synoptics Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Because they share that common core from Mark and Q.
Partly, yes. And because John presents such a different picture, the timeline, what's included, the whole theological feel, it's used, but often more cautiously, for strict historical reconstruction.
But isn't it funny, our source mentioned that back in the early church, Matthew and John were actually the most popular ones. Luke and Mark less so.
It is interesting, isn't it? It shows how perceptions change.
Seems backwards compared to modern scholarly focus.
It does. Looking at which manuscripts survived most, or which ones the early church fathers quoted most, it really points to Matthew and John having a kind of early prominence. It just highlights how different eras value these texts differently.
Okay, let's get into the actual content. They all tell the same basic story, don't they? Broad strokes.
And broad strokes, yes. You usually get John the Baptist, Jesus calling disciples, teaching, healing, clashing with the Pharisees.
Right.
And then it all moves towards his death on the cross and finally the resurrection. That core sequence is there.
But the source stressed that each gospel gives a unique take on Jesus.
Absolutely crucial point. Each one has its own distinct understanding of who Jesus was and his divine role. And importantly, scholars point out there are differences in the details between them that you just can't reconcile.
So trying to force them into one perfectly harmonized story is a bad idea.
It really is. According to most scholarship, you'd actually flatten out the unique theological message each author wanted to convey. You lose the individual voices.
Okay, so let's look at the synoptics first. Matthew, Mark, Luke, since they're the similar ones. Mark is the earliest, supposedly. What defines Mark?
Mark kind of jumps right in. Adult Jesus gets baptized by John. Big voice from heaven says, "You are my son."
No baby Jesus.
Nope, no nativity, straight to the action. Jesus gathers followers, starts teaching, doing miracles. A big theme in Mark is Jesus telling his disciples repeatedly that he has to go to Jerusalem to suffer, die, and rise again.
The messianic secret is kind of a thing in Mark too, isn't it? Telling people not to talk about his miracles.
Sometimes, yes, though the effectiveness of that is debatable in the story itself. The climax is Jerusalem. Enters to acclaim, then rejection, betrayal, crucifixion, and ends, famously, with the women finding the empty tomb.
And being scared and running away and not telling anyone.
In the oldest manuscripts, yes. They're terrified. Mark 16.8.
And our source noted some things Mark doesn't say.
Right. Mark never flat out calls Jesus God. Doesn't talk about him existing before his birth. Seems to work with the idea of, normal human parents and birth. No genealogy tracing him back to David or Adam.
And the original ending at 16.8 doesn't actually describe any resurrection appearances.
Correct. The earliest, best manuscripts stop there. Although verse 7 does have the young man telling the women to tell the disciples Jesus is going ahead of them to Galilee. So Mark clearly knew the tradition of appearances.
Interesting. So Matthew and Luke take that Markan foundation and build on it?
Exactly. They use Mark's storyline but add significant chunks. The most obvious additions are infancy narrative stories about Jesus' birth and childhood.
Which are quite different between Matthew and Luke, aren't they?
Very different, yes. And they both add much more detailed accounts of post-resurrection appearances. They also subtly shift the theology.
How so?
Well, take the miracles. In Mark, they mostly show Jesus has God's authority. He's God's agent. In Matthew, those same miracles often seem designed more explicitly to show Jesus' own divinity.
Little changes making a big difference, like the person at the tomb.
Right. In Mark, it's a young man. In Matthew, he becomes a dazzling angel descending from heaven, clearly a theological upgrade.
And Luke? Does Luke make similar changes?
Luke also expands on Mark, maybe even more polishedly. Luke's Greek is often considered better than Mark's. He seems to correct Mark sometimes or leave things out. He omits a big chunk of Mark, for instance, but he adds lots of teaching material, like huge sections in chapters 6 and 7 and many parables only found in Luke.
So Luke's shaping the material, too, for his own audience and purpose.
Definitely. Each author is an editor and theologian, not just a copyist.
Okay, finally, John, the unique one.
Yeah.
What makes John's content so different?
John is, well, the most overtly theological right from the start. Think of the opening. In the beginning was the Word.
Yeah, very different from Mark's baptism scene.
Totally. John makes these big Christological statements about Jesus outside the flow of the narrative itself, and the picture of Jesus' career is significantly different.
What's missing compared to the others?
No genealogy, no birth story, nothing about his childhood, no baptism scene with John the Baptist, no temptation in the desert, no transfiguration scene. Quite a lot is left out.
And the timeline's different, too, you mentioned.
Yes, dramatically. The synoptics can be read as implying maybe a one-year ministry. John clearly shows 3 Passovers, so at least 2, probably closer to 3 years.
And key events happen at different times.
Right. Cleansing the temple, beginning of the ministry in John, and the synoptics, the Last Supper. John has it before the Passover meal starts. The synoptics have it as the Passover meal. Big difference.
And is John the one where Jesus is most explicitly called God?
That's a point of debate, actually. Some scholars argue John is the only one to use the specific Greek construction, the God, for Jesus. Others find hints of divinity in the synoptics too, but what's undeniable is John's emphasis on Jesus' divinity and preexistence is much more upfront.
So unlike Mark's Jesus, who sometimes hides his identity,
John's Jesus proclaims it openly, almost constantly. I and the Father are one. Very different feel.
Okay, so stepping back a bit, all 4 written in Greek.
Correct. Koine Greek, the common language across the Mediterranean back then, like the rest of the New Testament.
And the dates, again, were roughly mark around 70 A.D.
Yep, probably just around the time the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed.
Matthew and Luke, maybe 85, 90 A.D.
In that ballpark, yeah. A generation or so after Mark.
And John later still, maybe 91, 10 A.D.
That's the general range, pushing into the early 2nd century, potentially.
And just to hammer it home, despite the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the scholarly view is anonymous authors, none likely direct eyewitnesses to Jesus' whole ministry.
That remains the consensus, yes. Anonymous works. Now, the author of Luke Acts is often thought to have been an eyewitness to some of Paul's travels.
But Paul never met the earthly Jesus.
Right, so even there, it's indirect when it comes to Jesus' own life. The Gospels are products of transmission oral and written drawing on traditions that claimed eyewitness origins, but not direct eyewitness accounts themselves.
It sounds like a multi-stage process.
That's how scholars usually picture it. Stage 1, oral traditions, just individual stories, sayings, parables floating around.
Not necessarily connected yet.
Right. Then, stage 2, people start writing down collections of these, sayings collections, miracle stories. These written bits exist alongside the ongoing oral sharing.
And Luke's preface even hints at this, doesn't it? Saying others had tried writing accounts.
Exactly. Luke 1.1 mentions many have undertaken to draw up an account. It suggests earlier written attempts, proto-gospels.
So stage 3, someone takes these written collections, maybe more oral stuff, and weaves them into the Gospels we know.
That's the final stage, yes. Combining sources to create a more coherent narrative.
And Mark's role as the earliest is key to seeing this.
Definitely. Mark seems to have used various sources, conflict stories, maybe an apocalyptic sermon, collections of sayings, but probably not Q, and likely not the Gospel of Thomas.
And Matthew and Luke then independently use Mark and Q plus their own M&L stuff.
Correct. That's the standard model. But it's important to see these aren't just authors responding to texts. They're plugged into this living stream of oral storytelling about Jesus in the early church.
Which explains why Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar in parts, the synoptic relationship.
Exactly. The overlap in content, order, even specific wording is just too much to be coincidence. There's a literary connection.
Whereas John, maybe the authors knew the synoptics but didn't lean on them like Matthew and Luke leaned on Mark.
That seems to be the case. They were aware, perhaps, but followed their own path, rooted in that Signs Gospel tradition from the Johannine community.
And one last point on sources, they all heavily use the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures.
Massively. Quotations, allusions, echoes everywhere. They're constantly interpreting Jesus' life and death through the lens of Jewish scripture. Some passages are practically mosaics of scriptural quotes.
And they probably use the Greek translation, the Septuagint.
Mostly, yes. Though something Matthew might have known some Hebrew texts, too.
Okay, let's circle back to genre and historical reliability. We said ancient biography, bios, but with an agenda.
Right. Genre-wise, bios fits best. Aimed at preserving memory, promoting the subject, giving examples to follow. But the Gospels are also preaching kerygma. They're trying to convince you.
Propaganda, almost.
You could say that. Persuasive literature, which is why historians read them critically, not just as neutral reports.
And the fact that Matthew and Luke clearly edit Mark, that adds another layer of complexity for historians, right?
It does. If you see Matthew changing Mark's wording or Luke rearranging Mark's order, it shows they're interpreting, not just recording. Add the contradictions between the synoptics, and especially between them and John. Well, it gets hard to say every detail in all four is equally historical.
Plus, the texts themselves weren't set in stone immediately. They got copied, and copies sometimes had changes.
A huge factor. We don't have the originals, only copies of copies of copies dating from much later. And scribes made mistakes. Sometimes they made deliberate changes, maybe to smooth out a difficulty, or harmonize accounts, or even add a pious thought.
Origen complained about this way back in the 3rd century.
He did, complain that manuscripts already differed wildly. Now, most differences are minor spelling things, word order, but some are significant. It just means textual criticism is vital.
So focusing on John again for a second. While it's theologically distinct, does it have any historical nuggets the synoptics miss?
Oh, potentially, yes. Scholars don't dismiss it entirely. Some sayings in John might be very old as anything in the synoptics. Its geography around Jerusalem is often thought to be pretty good.
Better than the synoptics.
In some specific details, arguably, yes. And its timing for the crucifixion before the Passover meal might actually be more plausible historically than the synoptic timing. Plus, some details about the arrest and the Jewish authorities' meeting seem credible.
But the idea that the author was the Apostle John, the eyewitness, still unlikely.
Very unlikely for the whole gospel as we have it. That figure of the beloved disciple is complex, but probably shouldn't be taken as a simple guarantee that the whole book is a first-hand account. So yeah, for the basic outline of Jesus' ministry, scholars usually still start with the synoptics.
This whole reliability question seems to really hang on how you view that period of oral tradition. We heard different takes.
Absolutely. How did stories get passed on for decades before being written down? Some scholars, drawing on memory studies, argue that communities can preserve important traditions quite faithfully, using mnemonic devices, repetition, authorized tellers. They argue for a fairly stable core memory.
Like done right, Keener.
Those are some of the names associated with arguments for reliability, yeah. They talk about community memory, maybe fixed forms for certain stories or sayings.
But then there's the more skeptical view.
Yes. Others stress how fluid oral stories are, how easily they change, adapt to new audiences, get embellished. The telephone game idea again. They point to inconsistencies, the influence of later theology shaping the memories.
Like Ehrman, maybe, focusing on the changes.
Ehrman is certainly a prominent voice emphasizing the alterations and developments in the tradition. Others, like Allison, focus on the fallibility of memory itself and prefer to trust patterns found across multiple sources rather than single accounts, though even Allison trusts the Gospel's general gist.
It sounds like trying to nail down the historical Jesus with absolute certainty is maybe impossible.
That feeling has definitely grown since the late 90s, the idea of stripping away all interpretation to find the purely objective facts. Many scholars now see that as unrealistic.
So the focus shifts.
It shifts more towards understanding the remembered Jesus, the Jesus perceived and proclaimed by the early church. As James Dunn put it, it's hard to separate the memory from the historical reality that prompted it. Some argue the historical Jesus is ultimately unattainable, but we can study how early Christians interpreted him through the Gospels.
But people are still researching the historical Jesus.
Oh, definitely. The field is alive and well, maybe overwhelmingly so. Allison laments the sheer volume of publications. But there's more caution, more methodological awareness now.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. What's the oldest actual piece of the gospel we have?
That would be Papyrus 52, usually called O52, tiny fragment.
What's it from?
From John's Gospel, dated to the first half of the 2nd century, so maybe only a few decades after John was written. It's pretty amazing.
And how did we end up with these 4 gospels being the official ones?
Right.
The canonization process.
It was gradual, probably got a push from guys like Marcion in the mid-2nd century.
Who was he?
He was a teacher deemed heretical who made his own mini-canon just to chopped up Luke and some of Paul's letters. He thought the Old Testament God was different and bad.
Ah, so the mainstream church reacted by defining their list.
Seems likely, yeah. It forced them to say, okay, these are the authoritative texts. The Muratorian canon, late 2nd century, is the earliest list we have that includes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And Irenaeus famously argued for exactly 4.
Yeah, Irenaeus of Lyons made that argument about the 4 corners of the earth, 4 winds, needed 4 gospels to match. He called it the Evangelion Tetramorphin, the fourfold gospel.
Which implies there were other gospels floating around that didn't make the cut, the apocryphal ones.
Loads of them, written over several centuries, often much later than the canonical 4.
And they often used fake author names.
Very common. Attributing a text to Peter or Thomas or Mary Magdalene gave it instant credibility, even if the apostle had nothing to do with it. And they usually reflected the specific beliefs of whatever group produced them, groups often later labeled heretical.
What kinds of things were in these other gospels?
All sorts. You had infancy gospels, filling in Jesus' childhood sometimes with pretty wild miracle stories, like in the infancy gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of James, or Proto-Evangelium, is where the idea of Mary's perpetual virginity first shows up.
So, filling in the gaps.
Exactly. There were ministry gospels, sayings gospels like the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, alternative passion and resurrection accounts, even attempts to blend the 4 canonical ones together like the Diatessaron.
And they reflected different theologies. You mentioned Jewish, Christian, and Gnostic ones.
Right. Some Jewish Christian gospels saw Jesus as the Messiah, but maybe not fully divine in the way mainstream Christianity came to understand him. More aligned with strict Jewish monotheism.
And the Gnostic ones.
Very different universe. Often saw the material world as flawed or evil, created by a lesser god, sometimes identified with the Old Testament God. Jesus was seen as a spirit, maybe only appearing to be human, bringing secret knowledge, gnosis, to help spirits escape the material trap. Less about sin and repentance, more about illusion and enlightenment.
Wow. So any specific apocryphal gospels that stand out from that list in our source?
Well, the Gospel of Peter gives a different passion story, mentions Herod being involved in the crucifixion, and has some docetic hints like Jesus being silent on the cross as if not feeling pain, rediscovered in Egypt in the 19th century.
And the Gospel of Thomas?
The Coptic one found at Nag Hammadi is huge. Just sayings, 114 of them. Some are like synoptic sayings, some are totally unique, some are pretty cryptic. Big debate. Does it have traditions as old as the synoptics, or is it dependent on them?
Gospel of Mary.
Focuses on Mary Magdalene as a key disciple receiving special revelation from the risen Christ. Explores soul's journey, overcoming passions, seen by some as Gnostic influenced.
Gospel of Judas. That sounds provocative.
It is, only rediscovered relatively recently. Presents Judas not as a villain, but as Jesus' best friend who betrays him at Jesus' request to help him escape his physical body. Very Gnostic perspective.
And Gospel of Barnabas.
That one's much, much later, probably medieval. It contradicts the New Testament on key points and actually reads more like an Islamic text, even mentions Muhammad by name. Completely different category, really.
That's a wild range of texts beyond the familiar 4. So wrapping this up, what are the big takeaways about the Gospels?
I think the main things are, they started as an oral message, the good news, and evolved into written books. Each canonical gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, offers a unique perspective shaped by its author and community.
They're not identical copies.
Not at all. They have complex origins, literary relationships, especially the synoptics drawing on Mark and Q. James stands apart theologically and narratively. And it's crucial to distinguish these canonical four from the many other apocryphal gospels that show the incredible diversity of early Christianity.
And the debates about who wrote them, when, how reliable they are historically, those are still very much alive.
Absolutely. Ongoing scholarship reflects just how foundational, but also how complex these texts really are.
So this dive gives us and our listeners that solid base, a clearer view of these hugely influential writings, drawn from what the sources tell us. They're not simple history books, but crafted messages.
Exactly. Theological interpretations embedded in narrative.
So final thought for you, the listener. Now that you have this sense of the different voices within the canonical Gospels and knowing there were so many other Gospels out there, how does that change how you think about history? About how ideas, especially really important ones about key figures, get passed down and shaped over time?
Yeah, what does it mean for a collection of texts with all their differences and specific viewpoints to become the foundational documents while others fade away?
Something to chew on. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these texts and all the fascinating scholarship around them. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. You know, it's almost unbelievable, but an eagle's eyesight is twice as sharp as ours.
It really is. Just imagine spotting your lunch from miles away.
Crazy.
Yeah,
Highlights the incredible, well, evolutionary pressures on these predators.
totally. They are absolute apex predators.
Absolutely fascinating. And today, you've curated a brilliant collection of information about eagles for us, diving deep into, well, the vast resources of Wikipedia.
That's the plan.
Our mission with this deep dive is to really uncover the most captivating aspects of these magnificent birds.
Get beyond just the basics.
Exactly. We're aiming for those truly interesting nuggets, far beyond just the, basic bird facts you might find in a field guide.
Yeah, the material you've shared is remarkably comprehensive. It covers everything from the origins of their name
Right.
to their incredible physical abilities, the diverse habitats they call home, the different groups they fall into,
Lots of groups.
specific examples of fascinating species, and even the profound ways they've influenced human culture. It's quite a range.
It's a real treasure trove.
Yeah.
What we want to do in this deep dive is give you, our listener, a kind of streamlined path.
A shortcut.
Yeah, a shortcut to understanding the most significant and surprising things about eagles. We're all about delivering those memorable details,
There's aha moment.
those satisfying aha moments without you having to feel like you're studying for an exam.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with something foundational, the story behind their name.
Sounds good. Well, the word eagle itself carries quite a long history.
Okay,
It entered English through Anglo-Norman and Middle French, both using the term aigle.
eagle.
And that ultimately traces back to the Latin word aquila, meaning eagle.
Aquila, got it.
And it's interesting, you see related words echoing across Romance languages like aigle still in French, águia in Portuguese, and águila in Spanish.
It's amazing how language connects us, isn't it? Across time and geography.
It really is.
And you also mentioned a less common term in English, ern or earn. What's the origin of that one?
Ern. That has even deeper roots in English. It comes from Middle English earn and Old English earn.
Older still.
Oh, yeah. That Old English word itself derives from the Proto-Germanic root arnaz,
Arnaz, okay.
which also gave rise to similar words in other Germanic languages, like earn in Swedish and ar in German.
Wow.
And its ancestry even extends further back to Proto-Indo-European. It links it to the Greek word odis, or nis,
Meaning bird.
meaning bird, exactly. And also the Lithuanian word erilis, meaning eagle.
Huh. So ern can mean any eagle, or is it specific?
Well, technically it can refer to any eagle, but nowadays we often use it specifically when talking about golden eagles or sea eagles.
Right, like the white-tailed eagle used to be called the ern.
Precisely. It's like a linguistic echo, really.
A specific term that still resonates.
Huh.
It's quite insightful. And the source has also touched on place names linked to eagles.
Yes, some really evocative examples. Kotka, a coastal town in southern Finland,
Okay.
literally translates to eagle. And then there's L'Aquila in central Italy, which simply means the eagle. L'Aquila makes sense. It underscores how significant these birds have been.
Absolutely. Shaping perceptions,
Yeah.
naming communities, even the words echo their importance.
Totally. Now, you mentioned the white-tailed eagle being called ern, Before 1678 in Britain, eagle itself meant something very specific.
That's right, it was quite exclusive. Prior to that time, in Britain, eagle was only used for the golden eagle.
Just the gold.
It's the golden. The other native species, the impressive white-tailed eagle, was known as an ern. So when did golden eagle become the common term?
It wasn't until the renowned naturalist John Ray came along. He popularized the modern term golden eagle for Aquila crustados.
John Ray, okay. So eagle started out as a much more exclusive club, linguistically speaking.
You could say that, yeah.
And there was a potential mix-up with a place name in Lincolnshire. Something about Oakley.
Ah, yes, the village of Eagle in Lincolnshire. You'd think it was named after the bird.
Seems obvious.
But it's actually not the case at all. Its name comes from Old English words meaning oak and wood. A bit like the name Oakley.
Huh. So oakwood,
Yeah.
not the bird, shows you need a closer look sometime.
Exactly, just like with the eagles themselves. Which, speaking of closer looks, brings us to how these creatures are actually built.
Right. Built for power.
I mean, they are top predators. They must have some remarkable physical attributes.
Definitely. When you observe an eagle, the first thing that strikes you is just their sheer size and powerful build. Those substantial heads, formidable beaks.
Yeah, really solid. And even eagles considered smaller, like, say, the booted eagle,
Okay.
which is comparable in size to a common buzzard, even they possess proportionally longer and broader wings.
Which helps with flight.
Allows them a more direct, rapid flight compared to other raptors of a similar size.
Right. But they aren't the absolute biggest birds of prey overall.
Well, many eagles are significantly larger than most other raptors, but you're right, some vultures and condors can actually be even larger in overall size.
It's all about perspective. Now, what about the extremes in size among eagles? The smallest and largest.
Okay, the smallest is the Great Nicobar serpent eagle. Tiny thing, relatively. Weighs about 450 grams, maybe 40 centimeters long.
Wow, quite small for an eagle.
Definitely. On the other end, the title of largest, well, it gets interesting. It depends how you define it.
How so?
We'll get into the specifics later, but it depends if you mean weight, length, or wingspan. But regardless of size, all eagles share fundamental adaptations for hunting.
Like those incredibly sharp beaks and talons. You mentioned the beaks earlier.
Precisely. Very large, hooked beaks, noticeably heavier than most other raptors, perfectly engineered for ripping through flesh.
Ouch.
And their legs, incredibly strong, muscular, culminating in those powerful talons, capable of gripping and holding prey with immense force.
And of course, their legendary eyesight. Can't forget that.
Absolutely not. That's key. The wedge-tailed eagle, for instance, its visual acuity is estimated to be twice as sharp as a typical human's.
Twice? That allows them to spot prey from astonishing distances.
It does, and a key factor is their exceptionally large pupils, which minimize light diffraction.
Better focus.
Exactly. But interestingly, like most birds active during the day, they don't have a well-developed ability to see ultraviolet light.
Huh. So they trade UV perception for that incredible long-range focus.
Seems like it. It's a fascinating trade-off in sensory abilities.
And one more physical point. The females tend to be the larger sex, right?
That's correct. Across all known eagle species, the female is typically noticeably larger than the male.
Interesting sexual dimorphism. Okay, let's shift focus. Where do these magnificent birds actually set up home, their habitats and habits?
Right. Well, eagles construct nests called eyries.
Eyries. Cool word.
It is. And they generally choose very secure, elevated locations. Think high up in mature trees or on the faces of steep cliffs.
Makes sense. Safe from ground predators.
Yeah.
And what about their families? How many eggs usually?
Many eagle species lay a clutch of 2 eggs.
2. Okay.
However, there is a rather stark reality that often plays out. The first hatched chick, being larger and stronger, will frequently kill its younger sibling shortly after it hatches.
Seriously. Kills its sibling.
Yes. It's called siblicide, and the parents typically don't intervene.
Wow. That's brutal. A harsh example of natural selection, I suppose.
Nature isn't always gentle, that's for sure.
Clearly not. Now, I've heard that saying about eagles flying above the clouds. Is there any truth to that?
That's actually a common misconception.
Knew it sounded a bit poetic.
Yeah. Eagles don't typically fly above the clouds. What they do is take advantage of storms.
How so?
They'll fly during stormy weather and use the pressure of the wind to help them glide effortlessly. It's very efficient, saves energy.
So they're not escaping the storm. They're using its power. Clever.
Masters of utilizing their environment. Makes perfect sense for an apex predator.
Speaking of which, they occupy the very top of the avian food chain, correct?
Absolutely. Due to their size, strength, hunting prowess, most eagle species are at the pinnacle of their ecosystems.
But their diets vary quite a bit.
Oh yes, a fascinating degree of variation depending on their genus.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples.
Well, the Haliaetus and Ichthyophaga eagles, those are the sea and fish eagles.
Right. Bald eagle is Haliaetus.
Exactly. They primarily feed on fish, either caught live or scavenged. Interestingly, the Haliaetus species also hunt other water birds and even engage in kleptoparasitism.
Klepto what? Stealing food?
Yep, stealing food from other birds.
Cheeky. What about other groups?
Then you have the snake and serpent eagles,
Hmm.
genera like Cercatus, Terathopius, Spilornis, their main diet. Snakes, lots of snakes from tropical Africa and Asia.
Diet of snakes. That's pretty specialized.
It seems specialized, yeah. Shows their adaptability, though, exploiting available resources.
Right. What about the Aquila eagles, the ones we often think of, like the golden eagle?
Aquila eagles are often the dominant predators in open habitats. They're quite opportunistic, preying on a wide range of medium-sized vertebrates.
Whatever they can catch.
Pretty much. And interestingly, in areas where Aquila eagles are absent, other eagles step in. Like the black-chested buzzard eagle in South America fills a similar niche.
Fascinating ecological roles. And forest eagles.
Many other eagles, like those in the Spizatus genus, live in woodlands and forests. They tend to use ambush tactics, hunting mammals and birds living in trees or on the ground.
So a really diverse menu depending on the type of eagle and where it lives. What about their general hunting techniques? How do they actually catch the prey?
In general, most eagles will seize their prey without actually landing,
Grab and go.
essentially. Then they carry it to a secure perch to dismember and eat it. But, individual eagles show varied strategies depending on the situation.
Adaptable hunters.
Right.
And I recall reading about a bald eagle carrying something incredibly heavy. What was that again?
Yes, the bald eagle holds the documented record for the heaviest load carried by any flying bird.
Which was?
One was observed flying with a 6.8 kilogram mule deer fawn.
6.8 kilos. That's about 15 pounds. For a bird to carry in flight. Astounding.
Truly remarkable strength.
But sometimes the prey is just too large to carry off, isn't it?
Exactly. Some eagles target prey significantly heavier than themselves.
Like what?
Well, in those cases, they either eat it right there at the kill site or maybe transport it back in pieces.
Makes sense.
Golden eagles and crowned eagles, for instance, have been known to successfully kill ungulates hoofed animals weighing up to 30 kilograms.
30 kilos. That's huge.
And get this, a martial eagle was even documented killing a duiker, a type of antelope that weighed an astonishing 37 kilograms.
Whoa. That's 7 or 8 times the eagle's own weight.
Mind-boggling power.
Just incredible. And the source also pointed out a difference in hunting behavior compared to other North American birds of prey. Something about looking back.
Yes, that was interesting. Ornithologists like David Allen Sibley noted that most raptors tend to look back over their shoulders.
Like checking behind them.
Yeah, either just before or shortly after striking prey. A sort of cautious behavior, maybe?
Okay.
But bald and golden eagles appear to be exceptions. They seem to commit fully to the strike without that backward glance.
Huh. More confident, perhaps? Or just different technique?
Could be. It's a subtle but interesting observation.
Definitely. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Let's talk about the sheer size of some of these titans of the sky.
Right, the size comparisons. Because when you picture massive birds of prey, eagles are definitely up there.
For sure.
And as mentioned, only condors and maybe some of the larger Old World vultures are generally considered markedly larger than the biggest eagle species.
But determining the largest eagle, you said it's debated.
It is, because, well, what does largest mean?
Right. Heaviest, longest,
Yeah.
widest wings.
Exactly. You could consider total length beak tip to tail tip, or overall body mass weight, or wingspan, wingtip to wingtip.
And different eagles excel in different areas.
Precisely. Because different species have evolved for different lifestyles and environments. Eagles in dense forests, like the harpy eagle,
Powerful bird.
incredibly, they tend to have relatively shorter wingspans, crucial for maneuvering through trees.
Makes sense. Less likely to get tangled.
Whereas eagles in open country, like many in the Aquila genus known for soaring, they typically have longer wings relative to their body size.
Built for efficiency in the open sky.
Yeah.
So these different measurements show largest isn't one single thing.
Not really. It's more about how remarkably adapted these birds are to their specific ecological niches.
Okay, so let's break it down. Who are the top contenders based on these different criteria? Let's start with weight.
Okay, average body weight. The top 5 heaviest. Number 1 is the magnificent Philippine eagle, weighing in at a substantial 8.3 kilograms on average.
8.3 kilos. That's hefty. Who's next?
Followed by Steller's sea eagle at 7.4 kilograms, then the powerful harpy eagle at 6.35 kilos.
Harpy's still up there.
Oh yes, then the white-tailed eagle at 4.8 kilograms, and the formidable martial eagle at 4.6 kilograms. Serious heavyweights.
They certainly are. Okay, what about overall length, tip to tail?
In terms of total length, the Philippine eagle again takes the lead, up to 100 centimeters long.
A full meter. Wow.
Close behind is the harpy eagle at 98.5 centimeters, then the wedge-tailed eagle at 95.5, Steller's sea eagle at 95, and the impressive crown eagle at 87.5 centimeters.
So the Philippine eagle is both very heavy and very long.
It is indeed a truly massive bird.
And finally, wingspan, that iconic measurement. Who rules the skies there?
For median wingspan, the white-tailed eagle boasts the largest at an impressive 218.5 centimeters. That's over 7 feet.
Huge wings.
Next is Steller's sea eagle at 212.5 centimeters, then the wedge-tailed eagle at 210 centimeters, the golden eagle at 207 centimeters, and the martial eagle at 206.5 centimeters.
So the white-tailed might not be the heaviest, but it has that incredible reach.
Exactly. Different metrics, different champions, really depends on what aspect of size you prioritize.
That's a fantastic overview. It clarifies why saying the largest is tricky. You also had a specific example of a golden eagle's diet in Mexico. Something about jackrabbits.
Ah, yes. Down in northwestern Chihuahua, Mexico. A study during breeding seasons from 2014 to 2016
Okay.
found that golden eagles there primarily preyed on black-tailed jackrabbits.
Made sense, probably abundant.
Very. Rabbits constituted about 72% of their total prey items, and get this, 86% of the total biomass consumed.
86%. So they were really focusing on those jackrabbits.
Heavily reliant on them in that specific environment, at least during breeding, shows how diet can be localized.
Fascinating. Okay, now let's talk about where these incredible birds can actually be found. Their global distribution. Where on Earth do eagles soar?
Well, the short answer is almost everywhere. Eagles exhibit an incredibly wide global distribution.
Really, all continents.
Pretty much. Found in nearly every part of the world, and they've adapted to thrive in a vast array of habitats.
Like what kind of habitats?
Everything from the frigid northern tundra to steamy tropical rainforests and even arid deserts. They're truly global citizens in that sense.
Incredibly adaptable. And we commonly see bald and golden eagles here in North America.
Exactly. They're quite widespread across the North American continent.
But what about other specific regions? The sources gave a more detailed breakdown.
They did. For example, Australasia.
Australia and nearby islands.
Right. You'll find the impressive wedge-tailed eagle, which actually extends into southern New Guinea, too. Also, the majestic white-bellied sea eagle, which is also found across parts of Asia, and the smaller little eagle in Australia.
And New Guinea itself.
Over in New Guinea, you've got the Papuan eagle, the white-bellied sea eagle again, and the pygmy eagle.
Okay. We covered the Nearctic North America with the bald and golden. What about the neotropics? Central and South America.
Ah, the neotropics are rich. Several species in the Spathatus genus, 2 distinct types of solitary eagles, the really powerful harpy eagle, the crested eagle, and the black-chested buzzard eagle. A lot going on down there.
Definitely. And the Palearctic region, Eurasia and North Africa.
The Palearctic hosts both the golden eagle and the white-tailed eagle spread across Eurasia.
So those two have huge ranges.
Massive ranges. And then sub-Saharan Africa. Just remarkable diversity.
Such as?
You've got the African fish eagle, the martial eagle, the crowned eagle, Verreaux's eagle, the tawny eagle, and the very distinctive long-crested eagle. Just to name a few.
Wow. It truly demonstrates their global reach and adaptability, which I guess leads us naturally to ask, how are all these different eagles related? Their family tree.
Exactly. Let's delve into that. The source material mentioned an informal way of categorizing eagles into different groups.
Right, 4 main groups.
Yes, often informally divided into 4. Fish eagles, booted eagles, snake eagles, and harpy eagles.
Okay. And traditionally, where did they fit in the bigger bird family tree?
Traditionally, the fish eagles, booted eagles, and harpy eagles were classified within the subfamily Bucceinae.
Bucceinae. That includes buzzards and harriers, too.
Exactly. Buzzard hawks, harriers, kites. A big group. However, there's ongoing scientific discussion.
Always changing taxonomy.
Always discussion about potentially separating these eagle groups into their own distinct subfamilies within the broader Accipitridae family. That's the main family for hawks, eagles, kites, etc.
So elevating their status, in a way. Creating bigger branches just for eagles.
Kind of. Grouping eagles with shared key characteristics in evolutionary history more formally.
Okay, let's explore these groups. Starting with the fish eagles, defining characteristics.
Well, as the name implies, they primarily eat fish.
Live or dead?
Both. Hunted live from the water or scavenged as carrion. They're proposed to be grouped into their own subfamily, Holiutinae.
Holiutinae, okay. And which genera are in there?
Includes the well-known Haliaetus genus, like the bald eagle, and the Ichthyophaga genus.
Got it. And there was some debate about another bird sometimes included, the palm-nut vulture.
Ah, yes, the vulturine fish eagle, or palm nut vulture, sometimes lumped in. However, genetic evidence actually suggests it's more closely related to the Egyptian vulture, the bearded vulture, and even the Madagascar serpent eagle.
Huh. So, similar lifestyle maybe, but different ancestry. Another case of appearances being deceiving.
Exactly. Convergent evolution, perhaps. Filling a similar ecological role, but not actually close relatives.
Interesting. What else about fish-eagle ancestry?
Genetically, they're closer to the Haliaster and Milvis kites than they are to the buteo hawks. And this whole fish-eagle kite group is only distantly related to the buteo group itself.
So the family tree is getting reshuffled. Where are fish eagles found?
Globally, pretty much, on every continent except South America.
And their conservation status? You mentioned threats earlier.
Sadly, yes. Despite their wide distribution, many fish eagle species are classified as near threatened.
Why is that?
A combination of factors, really. Overfishing, reducing their food source, pollution of aquatic habitats, habitat destruction, and the historical impact of pesticides like DDT.
A familiar sad story for many top predators. Okay, let's move on to the booted eagles. What makes them distinct? Something about feathers on their legs.
Exactly. Booted eagles, sometimes called true eagles, have feathered tarsi.
Tarsi being the lower legs.
Right. The lower part of their legs is covered in feathers, giving them that booted look.
Hence the name. Which genera are included here?
This group includes the tribe Aquilae, or the proposed subfamily Aquilinae. Contains genera like Aquila itself, Hieratus, Spicitus, Nicitus, Lochuitus, and several others.
A big group.
It is. But again, classification within these genera is currently undergoing revisions based on new genetic research. We'll touch on that more.
Okay, so beyond the feathered legs, what's the common thread?
Generally, they are powerful hunters, sharp talons, strong beaks, adapted for catching a variety of terrestrial prey mammals, birds, reptiles.
And these booted eagles have some fascinating migratory behaviors. You mentioned the Sahara crossing.
They do. The specific booted eagle species, Hieratus pinnatus, undertakes these impressive migrations across the Sahara Desert.
To breed where?
To reach breeding grounds in Europe. They arrive around March, then depart again by September.
Quite the journey. Do they pair bond?
Yes, they show a strong tendency to mate with the same partner year after year and return to the same breeding territories.
Faithful travelers and clutch size.
Usually lay 1 to 4 eggs. Incubation takes about 37 to 40 days.
And how many are there in Europe?
Estimates suggest several thousand pairs, maybe 3,600 to 6,900, with most found in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal.
Okay. Next up, snake eagles. Diet seems pretty obvious.
It certainly suggests they mainly prey on snakes, and that's correct.
Which subfamily are they in?
They belong to the subfamily Cercatinae, includes genera like Cercatus, Ballornis, and Terathopius.
And the Madagascar serpent eagle, is that one definitely in?
Eutriorchis. It's sometimes grouped here, but again, genetic evidence indicates it's not actually closely related to the other snake eagles.
Despite the name and niche.
Right. Another example, likely convergent evolution, filling the snake eater role, but from a different evolutionary branch.
What about their hunting? Are they picky eaters? Only certain snakes?
Research suggests they're generally more generalist feeders.
Meaning?
They don't seem to exclusively hunt specific types of snakes. They tend to prey on whatever snake species are most readily available and abundant in their particular habitat. Opportunistic snake hunters.
Makes sense. Finally, the harpy eagles. These sound truly impressive. giant forest eagles.
They really are very large eagles inhabiting tropical rainforests. That description captures their presence well.
How many species are in this group? Is it clear-cut?
Not entirely. The exact number can vary depending on the scientific author, sometimes 2, sometimes up to 6.
And are they all closely related despite being grouped as harpy eagles?
No, and this is a key point similar to the other informal groups. Despite occupying comparable niches as powerful forest hunters, they are not all closely related evolutionarily.
Examples.
Well, the solitary eagles are actually more closely related to blackhawks, and the incredible Philippine eagle,
The heaviest one we discussed.
that one, it's actually more closely related to the snake eagles.
Wow, okay, so the proposed subfamily Harpinae includes which ones officially?
Harpinae is proposed to include genera like Harpia, the harpy eagle itself, Morphnus, the crested eagle, and Harpiopsis, the Papuan eagle.
And the Philippine eagle and solitary eagles are sometimes included, sometimes not.
They are often discussed in this context due to their size and forest habitat, even if their closest genetic relatives lie elsewhere according to current data, like the Philippine eagle with snake eagles, Circasinae, and solitary eagles with butanine hawks.
It really highlights the complexities, doesn't it? How appearances and ecological roles can be misleading about ancestry.
Absolutely. It's why genetic research is revolutionizing taxonomy.
And you mentioned there are some significant taxonomic shifts happening within these groups too, especially Aquila and Hieratus.
Yes, exactly. Major recent research strongly suggests that these two genera, long thought to be groups of closest relatives.
The classic booted eagles.
Right. They are actually more of a mixed assemblage, not monophyletic, as scientists say.
Meaning not all descended from a single common ancestor exclusive to that group.
Precisely. This new understanding is likely to lead to significant reclassification. Some species might be moved to other genera, like Lophatus or Ictinatus.
So some eagles we thought were close cousins based on looks might be more distant relatives based on DNA.
That's the gist of it. It's like finding out two people who look alike aren't actually from the same immediate family.
Can you give specific examples of these changes, ones that have happened or are likely?
Certainly. Bonelli's eagle and the African hawk eagle. They've already been moved from Hieratus and are now placed within Aquila.
Okay, so Aquila got bigger there.
In that instance, yes. But then there's a strong possibility that the greater spotted eagle and the lesser spotted eagle.
Both currently in Aquila.
Yes, and perhaps even the Indian spotted eagle, too. They might be moved out of Aquila.
Moved where?
Potentially to join the long-crested eagle in the genus Lophatus. Or alternatively, all three might be grouped with the black eagle and the genus Ictinatus. Still being debated.
Complex stuff. Any others?
It's also now understood that the steppe eagle and the tawny eagle, long considered sister species, very close relatives.
Right, they look somewhat similar.
They do, but genetically, they are not even each other's nearest kin.
Wow. So the eagle family tree is actively being redrawn based on this new genetic data.
Constantly evolving our understanding. It's a dynamic field.
It really is.
Yeah.
You also had a brief list of some genera within the subfamily Butininae, just to give context for where eagles used to sit.
Yes, just quickly, Butininae is that big subfamily with hawks, buzzards, etc. It includes genera like Geranoides, that's the black-chested buzzard eagle we mentioned. The very diverse Buteo genus itself with typical buzzards and hawks, Parabuteo harris's hawk, Buteo gallus blackhawks and crabhawks, many others.
So it just shows the broader group where eagles were traditionally placed before these proposed changes to give them their own subfamily.
Exactly. It provides that wider taxonomic context.
Okay, fascinating stuff on the biology and taxonomy. Let's shift gears now and explore the huge role eagles have played in human culture. Their image is so powerful.
It really is. Clearly resonated deeply throughout history.
Absolutely. And it seems to connect back, in some ways, to the very origins of their name.
It does. We talked about the Latin root aquila. Interestingly, some etymologists think that might derive from aquilus, meaning dark-colored or blackish.
Ah, maybe referring to their plumage.
Possibly, yeah, a reference to the plumage of certain species. And the Old English term erne, related to Scandinavian erne. It shares ancient roots with other Indo-European words for bird or eagle, Greek ornis, Russian oriole, Welsh urir.
So the concept and the word have been around in human language for a very, very long time.
Suggests a long history of interaction and observation, definitely.
And their image pops up frequently in religious and spiritual contexts across cultures.
Indeed. In ancient Sumerian mythology, there's that compelling myth of King Etana being carried to heaven by a majestic eagle.
Wow. Up to the heavens.
And classical writers like Lucan and Pliny the Elder, they held beliefs about eagles being able to gaze directly at the sun without harm.
The sun-gazing thing again.
Yeah, and that they tested their fledglings by forcing them to do the same, casting out any that blinked or showed weakness. A powerful image that persisted.
A potent symbol staring unflinchingly at the sun. What about in Greek mythology? They were linked to Zeus.
Oh, very much so. The eagle held a particularly prominent position as the patron animal of Zeus, king of the gods.
How so?
Zeus was said to have taken the form of an eagle on several occasions, perhaps most famously to abduct Ganymede.
Right, Ganymede. Seen that in art.
It's a frequent depiction, really highlights how deeply ingrained the eagle's image is in our collective consciousness.
Definitely. What about in the Old Testament and Judeo-Christian traditions?
Eagles appear metaphorically in many translations. Exodus talks about God carrying Israel out of Egypt on eagle's wings.
Powerful image of deliverance.
Isaiah uses eagle soaring to describe renewed strength for those trusting God. Psalms speak of youth being renewed like the eagles.
Renewal, strength, deliverance. Strong themes.
Even Augustine of Hippo commented on the renewal aspect, suggesting eagles broke their old beaks against rocks to rejuvenate them.
Really? Broke their beaks.
Well, that was his interpretation. It's worth noting the original Hebrew word used in Psalms could also refer to a vulture.
Ah, okay. So maybe not biologically accurate, but the symbolism holds.
Exactly. Power, deliverance, renewal. Those symbolic meanings remain strong.
And in Christian iconography more broadly, representing one of the Gospels.
Yes, the eagle is often the symbol representing the Gospel of John.
Why John?
It stems from those earlier beliefs about eagles gazing at the sun, interpreted as John's Gospel looking directly at Jesus' divine nature, and the eagle's high flight symbolizing the spread of the gospel message.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which is why you see eagle-shaped lecterns in churches.
Precisely, lecterns shaped like eagles from which the scriptures are read.
What about in other cultural contexts, more contemporary ones or indigenous traditions?
Well, in the United States, there's the eagle feather law. Very important.
Regulating possession of feathers.
Yes, regulating who can obtain and possess eagle feathers, primarily for Native Americans for religious or spiritual purposes. Sadly, this high cultural value also leads to issues like poaching.
A difficult balance. Other cultures.
The Moche people of ancient Peru revered the eagle, featuring it prominently in their art. For the Aztecs, the golden eagle was sacred to their powerful god Huitzilopochtli,
Okay.
and the harpy eagle held similar significance for the deity Quetzalcoatl. So across diverse cultures, vast periods, the eagle consistently holds profound spiritual meaning.
It really does. Okay, finally, let's touch upon eagles and heraldry. Flags, coats of arms, they're everywhere.
Very common sight, yeah.
What makes them such a popular choice in heraldry?
Well, in heraldic language, the eagle is revered as the king of birds.
Like the lion is king of beasts.
Exactly. While the lion often symbolizes authority, royalty, the eagle primarily represents power, courage, and farsightedness.
Power and vision.
They're particularly prominent in Germanic countries due to the historical association with the Holy Roman Empire.
The imperial eagle, sometimes two-headed.
Right. Often depicted as a two-headed eagle, symbolizing the Eastern and Western Roman empires. That motif was also adopted by Russia, Albania.
So it spread. But eagles were used even before the Holy Roman Empire.
Oh, yes. Examples in Ptolemaic Egypt, the Achaemenid Empire in Persia. It's an ancient symbol of power. Even Kotka, Finland, the town named Eagle. Its coat of arms has an eagle carrying an anchor and a caduceus.
Mixing eagle power with maritime and commercial symbols. Clever.
It is! Shows its versatility as a symbol.
Are there specific ways eagles are usually shown in heraldry? Poses?
Yes, common postures. Most often displayed wings and legs spread wide.
The classic spread eagle.
That's the one. Also close, with wings folded or rising, looking like it's about to take flight. And sometimes you just see parts, heads, wings, legs used as independent charges.
And what do they generally symbolize in these national or family emblems?
Overwhelmingly, across the globe nations, families' eagles symbolize strength, courage, and a spirit of independence.
Which nations use them?
Oh, loads. Albania, the United States, Germany, Mexico, Poland, Egypt, Russia. Many others proudly feature eagles on their coats of arms. Demonstrates its enduring worldwide appeal as a potent national emblem.
Transcends borders and political systems.
It really does.
So, from ancient myths and religious beliefs right through to modern national symbols, the eagle truly occupies a remarkable, significant place in human culture.
Absolutely undeniable.
Okay, let's bring this fascinating deep dive to a close then.
Sounds good. So when you pull it all together, I mean, from their incredibly sharp visions,
good as ours.
allowing them to spot prey from huge distances to their diverse, specialized hunting strategies in different environments,
Fish eagles, snake eagles.
and those remarkable variations in size, weight, wingspan reflecting their adaptations.
Yeah.
It's just clear they're far more than just large birds. They're a testament to the power of evolution.
Totally agree. And when you layer on that profound symbolic weight across so many cultures,
Representing power, freedom.
a connection to the divine, even, it's evident they've captured our imaginations for millennia.
They certainly have.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, a really rich and engaging understanding of these magnificent creatures, delivering those aha moments without, feeling like homework.
Exactly. A shortcut to the cool stuff.
Yeah.
And as we reflect on the eagle's long history as this potent symbol, and with ongoing research continuously refining our understanding of their taxonomy, their behavior.
Which is constantly changing.
Right. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What future discoveries might yet reveal about these truly awe-inspiring birds, and maybe about our own intricate relationship with them.
That is definitely something to ponder.